Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Watts 007 series, 007. This is a double check assembly. They also have a reduced pressure principle assembly called the model 009. This particular series, 007, double checks, and 009s have probably had more changes throughout their production. Production began around late 80s, around 89-ish, produced to this day, still in production. But when they would make changes and revisions, they would add a M designation afterwards, so M1, M2, M3, as they changed and improved product over the years. Got a little confusing, people, because if you didn't have the right M designation, you may not get the right parts, because the parts were not interchangeable between most of the modifications. And keeping track exactly which modification you had was important. For instance, if you look at this chart here in the 007 series, half through 6-inch, all of them were produced. They're only producing up to 3-inch today. The 4 and 6-inch was produced for a very short period of time and wasn't released for regular production. There are very few of those out there, but most of the ones we'll talk about will be the half through 3. But for instance, you see on the half-inch size that there's a 007. On the 3/4, there could be a 007, an M1, M2, or an M3. In the 1-inch, you could have a 007 and M1. You know, 1.25 inch, it could be an M2. 1.5 would be 007, M1, M2. 2-inch, 007 and M1. 2.5 and 3-inch only had one version. So making sure you had the right model number was important to get the right repair parts, because as you can see, they had several different versions within those models. Here's some pictures of what they look like. The half through 2-inch were basically a bronze body unit. This one shows a picture of a 3/4 inch, but be aware that they will not all look like this. Some will have a 4-bolt cover, some will have a 2-bolt cover, some will have a 6-bolt cover. Depending on which M version it was, they do not look identical from the outside. The 2.5 and 3-inch is a cast iron body that's fused epoxy coated. It will either be a 2 or a 1-piece body. In the picture here you can see the older 2-piece body, where at the second check there's that little separation there. In the newer versions being after about 2002 or 3, they went to a 1-piece body design on that assembly. But anyway, flange body repair on both of them come out from the top. Single axis cover from the top on the small one. Single axis cover from the top on the larger, meaning 2.5 through 3-inch. What caused a lot of consternation with people was the different versions. Here's the 3/4 1-inch 007. The original one had a screwed-on cover. All of the other ones now have bolted-on covers, and even the M1, M2, 3 version of the 3/4 also have bolted-on covers now. But some of them had screwed-on cover, like you see here, but most of them do have some type of a bolted-on cover. The check mechanisms is what got to be confusing, because they've gone through several different versions on the sizes and different types. They've had the ones like this where they were a little 8-turn rotation would separate them. They would have the press together types. They would have the bayonet style where a little 8-turn rotation would take it apart. We'll go through all of those different checks, showing you exactly how they work, giving you examples of each one. On the 2.5 through 3-inch, same internal design, single axis cover from the top. Checks were inline, just as we saw on the smaller versions. And the smaller versions also had that inline construction design, as we saw, just as it does in the smaller ones. But kind of a footnote valve is the 4 through 6-inch. This is a valve that was in very, very short production. It wasn't released for average circulation. Put out in areas where they were trying to test a new market. So I doubt if you'll see any of those out in the field. In the 007 series, they also produced a double check detector assembly in the sizes 2, 2.5, and 3-inch. Here's a picture showing you what the 2.5 and 3-inch one looks like, using the 007 with the bypass assembly around it. So they did make a double check detector assembly version using the 007 models on the 2, 2.5, and 3. The reduced pressure principle assembly is the model 009, as I mentioned, and they too have the M1, M2, M3 designations of the different changes they've made over the years. Production from the 1/4 inch on the small size up to 3-inch. In the RP series, they also produced a stainless steel body version in the smaller sizes, which was used in areas where they wanted stainless steel body with non-bronze materials. Like the 007 and the 009, having the correct M designation was critical to make sure you had the right repair parts. As you can see in the 1/4 and 1/2 we had a 009. In the 3/4 we had a 009. We had an M2 and an M3. In the 1-inch there was a 009 and an M2 version. 1.25 had a 009, an M1 and an M2. Same with 1.5 and 2-inch. 2.5 and 3-inch had just the one version that we had to worry about. The 009 series had that same single access cover as we saw in the 007s. Check valves were in line, same as the 007s. The relief valve, though, went right through the center of the two check assemblies. Here's showing what the smaller version, the 3/4 1-inch, looked like. 2-inch over here. Check mechanisms in line in the center, relief valve down through the center. Same concern with the check mechanisms they've had. They had the bayonet design, the 8th turn rotation, the press together, and a couple other designs that we're going to go through as we see them. Depending which M version you had, which size you had, this can be a problem making sure which type of check assembly you'll see inside there. So you want to be able to prepare all four of those different types because they may come up that way. Sometimes the tags will be missing on the assemblies, and identifying the M1 and 2 can be difficult. Usually identifying the number of bolt holes and the pipe size can narrow it down to within a couple models. Another thing that can help you identify them is the end-to-end dimension. As it shows, dimension A in this chart has different sizes depending whether it's an M1, M2, or M3. And again, it is critical to have the correct M designation to obtain the proper repair parts. So whether you have the exact model on the assembly, the tag is missing and you can't identify it, you can do a physical by the number of bolts on the covers. And if that doesn't work, get the end-to-end dimension of the assembly, which may or may not help you identify it. The dimension D, as you see here, is very critical because sometimes the ball valves may be replaced later and may have different end-to-end lengths. So getting the true length of the body may help you identify that assembly. But again, the dimension A is usually one most people look at. 2.5 and 3 inches, a picture of what the 009s look like. Here's that 2-piece body as I was discussing earlier, and here's the 1-piece body showing what that looks like on the 2.5 and 3 inch. Again, cast iron body, fused epoxy coated. The construction of it is very similar to the small ones, just larger. The checks are internal, in line, and the relief valve is mounted through the center with relief valve seat on the bottom and the diaphragm on the top. Single access cover from the top allows access into the checks and the relief valve for the repair, so it's a single access cover. 2.5 and 3 inch, here's the breakdown outside of the assembly. The body, as you can see, there's the two check assemblies in their exploded view. Relief valve here and the relief valve stem in its exploded view on the side here, showing the check assemblies like this. 2.5 and 3 inch. So 007 double check, 007 double check detector assembly, 009 2.5 through 3 inch RP. Those are the ones we're going to talk about. Check assembly is very similar. Obviously spring loads will be different. Construction materials will be different depending on size. 2 inch and under is bronze. 2.5 and 3 is going to be the cast iron fused epoxy coated. So let's go ahead and take them apart and take a look and see what they look like inside. In the Watts 007 009 series, here's the original 3/4 007, here's the original 3/4 009, and here's the most current 3/4 inch 009. There have been some dramatic changes in the bodies and the sizing of the assemblies. So I want to talk about the philosophy, if you will, of the 009 and what's happened over the years and why they've changed. The bottom line is the older versions were larger. As the M2, M3 came, the bodies started getting smaller and smaller. As you can tell here on the RP version, we went from the large 009 version, which was here, and this is the latest version, the M3. The body's about half the size. Well, one of the concerns with the inline check designs was always dirt and debris. And one of the ways of minimizing dirt and debris settling in the check valves was to have good velocity as the water went through the assembly. So by downsizing the assembly, it increased velocity, which helped scour the dirt and debris out of the bodies. So anytime you see the M3 designations, as a general rule of thumb, everything has been downsized, and downsizing had to do with scouring and cleaning the bodies. But one of the problems with increasing velocity is it creates a lot of turbulence inside the body that caused a lot of things with parts coming apart inside the assembly. So they were constantly changing things so that it would adapt to the higher velocities, no dirt and debris settling in it, and those type of issues. First thing on the oldest model, I always like showing this one because this is the original 009, 3/4 inch size. And I always laugh because people say, oh yeah, as long as you look at the tag, you can identify the assembly. Well, if you read this tag closely here, it says model QT. Well, this is not a QT model. QT happens to mean that it has the quarter-turn ball valve shutoffs on the assembly. QT is not a model number. This is a model number 009. So if you look down over here where it says number 009, that's actually the model designation on this particular one. So every version like this they made, technically the serial number tag was wrong. So a lot of people had this one confused. They would constantly call up and say, hey, I want a model QT repair kit. I'm saying, no, it's not a model QT. What model is it? Because QT meant quarter turn, and it could be on any model. Another thing you'll notice on the 009 series is that you're going to see on all of them except the 1-inch M2 is a breather hole on the top here. In other words, there's a small little hole in the center where the air breathes in and out. And we'll talk about that when the relief valve comes apart. So first of all, identifying the bodies. Big difference in sizes, as you can see, between the original and the M3 versions and the 3/4 inch. And obviously the repair parts and techniques are going to be different. You can see why the repair kits are not interchangeable between the different models. So let's go ahead and take our oldest version, the 3/4 inch 009 apart. That's the one that had the wrong designations on it, as I said. 4 bolts on the cover. Go ahead and take cover bolts off. There will be relief valve spring tension underneath. So the cover comes off in one piece like this. It's sealed by an O-ring. And that's an important trick on all of these models. Relief valve stem comes next. Relief valve spring here. So what it's like is this. It's sitting inside that assembly with the cover on top, just like that, to visualize it. Next thing we're going to do is remove the retainer. And what this retainer does is it holds the checks into the body. Showing you on the 3/4 cutaway version, this white piece right here is my retainer. And there's my check, and here's my other check over there. So the retainer holds the 2 checks in the body. So by pulling the retainer out like that, it's going to give me access to the 2 checks. I'm going to have my first check over here and second check over here. So to remove the check assemblies, I'm going to, and they're sealed by an O-ring inside the check, pull the check assembly out of the body. Now, that check is sitting in there like this. So as I'm pulling it, I'm pulling that O-ring across the bore inside that body. It's critical that you have your number 4 test cock open at this point and your number 2 test cock when you pull the first check, because think about it. If this is sitting inside the body like that and I don't open this number 4 test cock, as I go to pull this out of the body, I'm creating a vacuum on the back side and the check assembly will not come out. First check assembly will come out next. Get it outside the body so you can see it. And there's the first check. So inside that body, what was this? Our check assemblies were sitting between the retainer, just like that. Flat side on the second check. The point side here on the first check, just like this. Relief valve stem went through the center of the retainer, like this. The relief valve seat, which is inside the body, comes out, it's pushed in, held in, sealed by an O-ring, and the cover sits on top. So those are the parts of the 009. This is the oldest version of the 3/4 inch, the original 3/4 inch. Let's go ahead and talk about the check valves first, and then we'll talk about the relief valves. Now, first check and second check. On the 3/4 inch, on the oldest version, there was one unique piece that didn't appear on any other ones. This little stainless steel washer here, kind of like a hat on the top. It's called a diffuser. Function of that was several things. One is the check valve opened and water came through it like this. It would diffuse the water out around there, which would help stabilize the turbulence as the water came out of there, because it would put it in an outward fashion along the body, making it more streamlined or less turbulent, if you will. That only appeared on the 3/4 inch and only appeared in the original 009 version. The original versions like this were a check assembly that had to be disassembled by twisting it. You would grab the bottom portion where the seat was, the upper portion where the spring retainer was, give it an 1/8 turn rotation, and it would release the spring tension. There were small little clips right here that corresponded to clips on the seat. So you twisted it 1/8 turn, it came apart. Check spring, check disc holder, check seat. Now the original version of this assembly, when you bought a rubber repair kit, they gave you a flat rubber disc because you were supposed to stretch the disc in and out of the holder. But as they went to the newer designations of the M1s, M2s, M3s, as I said, they started increasing the velocity as it went across that check assembly by downsizing the body. So every time they downsized the body, they had a concern that now the disc was being sucked right out of the disc holder. So they went to a different designs where the check assemblies started having less and less exposed area. In other words, the original version, you can see how much of the check disc you see here on a 3/4. Here's a 2-inch one from an M2, and look how little of that disc was actually exposed through there. Here's a cutaway of that disc holder. I want you to get a good close-up of this because this is important understanding on the check mechanisms. You'll notice that as they went to the M designations, instead of having the large open area, it was less. But what they did is they sonic welded these two. In other words, the original one here was a stainless steel washer that was pressed onto the stainless steel. As they went from this wide area, going from a brass disc holder, they went to a plastic disc holder. Minimized corrosion, minimized other issues they had with the metallic concerns, but they went to a more enclosed disc holder. You can notice how most of that disc is actually held underneath, just like that, underneath the disc holder. Well, it wouldn't be possible to stretch that disc out of that disc holder with that small exposed area like it was on the older versions. So what they started doing is they did what's called the sonic welding. They took the two pieces of plastic and they literally melt them right there. So those two pieces are melted and cannot come apart. And because the disc was so contained, you couldn't change it in the field anyway. So when you buy a modern repair kit now, they give you the version where the disc is already assembled. Well, on the M2, M3 version, they had to do that way. The original version, they didn't have to, but they do include it in the disc holder in the kits now because it was just easier to be consistent for them. So they went to a more contained check assembly, and this is the more common one where it was that little bayonet design with the 8th turn rotation. But they had different versions over the years. Again, here's that 2-inch check assembly. Again, with that, whether it's a 3/4 or 2, you can see it's the same basic construction of that bayonet design. There's the M2 version where you can see it's a little less retained. But on the smaller sizes, and smaller sizes being 3/4, we had some options we had to see. Let's start with the 1/2-inch version first. The 1/2-inch version check looked like this. And at first glance, you notice that there's a red and a white and a black section, the white disc retainer and the black seat portion, and it just twists like this. There's no quarter turn that's going to separate. You actually had to use a small little screwdriver to get in, separate the two pieces, like, ouch, like that. There's your seat, there's your disc holder, there's your spring, and there's your spring retainer. So instead of twisting it together, it was pressed together. And that took place on basically on the 1/2-inch size of check assemblies. In the 3/4, they went from this basic design to this design. Now, at first glance, it looks like it's going to be similar to this one where it's pressed together, but this one you grab it and it's one piece, it doesn't twist. If you look on the back side, you'll notice that the spring retainer is loose. It's what's called the bayonet style, where you push in, twist it 1/8 of a turn, and out comes the spring retainer, the spring, disc holder, and the check seat. Now the problem with this design was they had a lot of concerns where the check assembly was coming apart inside the body. In other words, this little piece was pushed in here and just held in by that spring, and unfortunately as it came apart, or people took it apart, didn't put it back together correctly, and it came apart inside the water passageway. So they had a revision where they went to this version. Now this version looks similar to this one, but this time it is two pieces. So this one, like the 1/2-inch one, a little small screwdriver get in here and allows you to separate. So I need a little bigger screwdriver. There we go. So I have my spring retainer, my spring, disc holder, and seat. So this version, unlike this one, didn't have trouble, but unfortunately this version, because it was pressed together, when you go to pull the check assembly out of the body, especially if you didn't have the number 4, number 2 test cock open, the thing would split inside the body. So they went to the M3 version, which is this one, which this particular one unscrews, the same, that rotation on the seat. And you know how we hold the top and the bottom? Here's my seat portion and here's my spring retainer. By twisting this, that small 8th turn rotation, my check seat, my disc holder, my spring, and my spring retainer. So those are the basic types of mechanisms you're going to see. The newest version is this one, where it's a disc and a disc holder, sonic welded, check seat, check spring, and putting it back together is that 8th turn rotation. Earlier version was this one where the disc, now notice on this one, instead of there being a disc holder with a side on it, that the disc actually has an exposed side area. That's because the check assembly is guided by the sides of this particular seat right here. Notice these 4 little fins right here. The 4 little fins are going to guide that check assembly through its travel and make sure that it stays stable through travel. We talked how important the guide is in that particular design. Now again, this one when you go to put it together, and I'll put this next to the microphone because when you get it ready, it should have this type of a sound. It should literally click, and that's that one piece of that. Now, this is the one that had that little same type of guides in the center that you can see there, the 4 fins there. And again, when you bought a repair kit, it came with the entire check disc holder, check spring, and this little spring retainer, which just had a little twist and bayonet like that. Then the small 1/2 inch one, which was similar to what we saw in the second version there, disc holder, spring, and this one clicked together with that same clicking sound. I'll put it next to the microphone again. That type. The more common one is this one, which appears on the larger sizes, 1.5" and 2, where there is a separate seat, a disc holder, which may be brass like this in the oldest versions, but are all plastic today. Check spring, spring retainer. That little 1/8 turn rotation puts the check assembly together. So those are the basic versions that you're going to see. It's either going to be a 1/8 turn, push together, that bayonet on the spring retainer, push apart, or that 1/8 turn twist on this design. Again, these are the smaller ones showing you, but showing you what the large one looks like, just like that, to get an idea what you're going to be looking at. There's a 2-inch version right there. So the check assemblies, the key thing to remember is they went from an old style where the disc was rather large and exposed to a contained disc like that could not be pulled out of the disc holder. Because of the containing of that disc, they could not pull the disc out of the holder in the field, and so they started just selling you the whole disc retainer like that. And that's what would come in the repair kit, is the disc retainer instead of the flat rubber disc. Now, we talked earlier today about buying the right parts. When you rebuild all of these check assemblies, they make a rubber repair kit which contains some kind of O-ring, some type of check disc with a disc holder. And if you buy the rubber repair kit, this is a relatively economical assembly to rebuild. But if you buy the whole check assemblies like this, which unfortunately some people will do because they don't think the checks are repairable, which they are, as you can see, then yes, rubber kits are far cheaper than a check module. If you buy the whole check module, you're buying more than you need for the proper repair of that assembly. So those are the versions of the check valve that took place over the years, and depending which version you had, M1, M2, M3 would be in there. Now, we talked about this retainer being in there. Earlier today, when we were talking about design and construction of assemblies, we talked about that relationship between the third of a thickness of the rise of the seat cannot penetrate the disc more than a third of its thickness, and that causes that disc compression concern. Anytime you have an inline check design like this, though, you have another concern, and the concern you have now is that you have movement of these check assemblies. In other words, you will notice on this 3/4 style, I can get my finger in there and I can move that fairly easily, can't I? So not only do I have the movement of the third of a thickness of the disc, now I've got the concern with the movement of the check assemblies. So the retainers of these models are very, very important. On the 3/4 and 1-inch, for instance, the original version of the retainer looked like this. It was a stainless steel piece. It was 2 pieces like that, and it sat inside the body like this. But like this one, it could be collapsed relatively easily. Even when people were repairing it, they used to rip it out from the top. Showing you the old 007 version, here's what that retainer looked like inside the body. Once it's in the body, it looks good, but you can see where that lip is on the bottom. So if there was a back pressure condition, what would happen? It would cause that check assembly to push backwards and cause the check to move. So they went from this design to a welded stainless steel design where it was 1 piece. The trouble with the welded 1-piece design is now inside that body, it got very hard to remove. You had a stainless steel retainer on a brass body, and sometimes it would literally corrode to the point where it would stick in the body and would be hard to remove. So also another thing with the retainer is that if the check assemblies weren't all the way in the body, the retainer couldn't go in from the top. In other words, these checks had to be all the way back here so that the retainer would go between them. It was kind of a good test to make sure you had the check assemblies all the way in. But if it didn't go, what would you do? Well, you had to get it back in somehow. Well, the newer design they went with was a plastic construction. One, so they didn't have the problems with the dissimilar metals, but it's also slightly sharper at the end where it's easier to get in. So if it's not all the way in, pushing it down will cause the check assembly to push into the body just like that. And as you can see, this is a little more stable than this design. And depending which of the M2, M3 versions you have, you'll either have a plastic retainer or a stainless steel retainer. Some of the stainless retainers are the old style, and some of the stainless are in the new style. But the function of the retainers is to keep the stability of those checks so they don't move back and forth inside the body. And that's the important part of these checks, is understanding, one, how they come apart, whether it's an 8th turn rotation, whether it's a screwdriver disassemble, and the retainer itself. Where the O-ring sits inside the body is critical. Every check assembly that seals by an O-ring, that O-ring, as we talked about how that works, that O-ring has to be loaded. So with the body, you have to get in and look inside there to make sure the bore inside that body is good, so I can confirm that where that O-ring is sitting, it's going to seal. Obviously, it's hard to get in there and look. Small little mirror helps you get inside, looking in there, getting your finger in there to check, and make sure you don't have any problems where the O-ring seals. Because you have any scale inside there, you have to remove it. If it's corroded, you may have to replace the body, because if it's corroded where that O-ring seals right there inside the body, that check assembly will not seal. So this is the check assemblies that we see in the 007 and the 009 version.